There's a number stamped on the side of every oil bottle, and most people are misreading what it actually means for their engine. You see a 0W20 and you think thin, light, maybe fine for a modern economy car. You see a 10W40 and you think serious, protective, something that's actually going to keep your engine alive. Heavier feels safer, thicker feels like insurance. It's an instinct. That makes complete sense. And according to the engineering data, it's leading a lot of people in exactly the wrong direction. Today, we're going to look at what actually happens inside an engine when you run oil that's heavier than the specification calls for. Not opinions, not forum debates. We're talking about SAE studies, OEM internal testing, and what engineers who actually design these engines have documented about viscosity and wear rates. Because the gap between conventional wisdom and what the data shows is wider than most people expect. The logic behind thicker oil has always seemed airtight. If oil's job is to keep metal parts from touching each other, then a thicker film should be a stronger barrier. Think of it like a cushion. The denser the cushion, the more force it absorbs. For most of automotive history, that thinking wasn't entirely wrong. In older engines, with wider tolerances and less precise machining, thicker oil did provide meaningful protection. A 20W50 in a carbureted V8 from the 1970s made a lot of sense. Mechanics learned this, passed it down, the recommendation stuck. The problem is that engines changed. Manufacturing tolerances got tighter, oil passages got narrower, clearances between moving parts shrank from measurements you could feel to measurements you need precision instruments to detect. The entire relationship between viscosity and protection shifted, and the old logic didn't update with it. Here's where it gets complicated, and this is the part that took engineers a long time to communicate clearly. Oil is not doing one job inside your engine. It's doing several jobs simultaneously, and some of those jobs are in direct tension with each other. Understanding that tension is the key to understanding why thicker isn't always better. The first job is hydrodynamic lubrication. This is the one people think of: creating a film between moving parts so they never actually contact each other. Your crankshaft, your camshaft, your rod bearings, they're all riding on a pressurized wedge of oil. This is where viscosity matters in the way most people imagine. Thicker oil does maintain film thickness under high load and high heat. That's real, that's not disputed. But here's the second job, getting to those parts in the first place. Oil doesn't sit in one place and wait for metal to come to it. It gets pumped through a network of passages, some of them incredibly narrow, to every bearing surface, every lifter, every cam lobe in the engine. The oil pump generates pressure, but pressure alone doesn't tell the whole story. Flow rate matters too. And this is where viscosity cuts both ways. Thicker oil flows slower, not dramatically slower under normal operating temperature, but meaningfully slower during the one moment it matters most: cold startup. Think about what happens in those first 8 to 15 seconds after you turn the key. The oil pump is spinning, it's generating pressure, but the oil is at ambient temperature. It hasn't warmed up yet. If you're running an oil that's heavier than the engine was designed for, it moves through those passages with resistance. There are parts of that engine, specifically the top end, the valve train, the cam bearings, that can go several seconds without adequate lubrication during a cold start. Here's the number that changes how people think about this. According to research published by the Society of Automotive Engineers, somewhere between 75 and 80% of all engine wear occurs during cold start, not during hard acceleration, not during towing, during the first few seconds of every single drive, before oil pressure fully stabilizes and before the oil reaches every surface it needs to reach. Let that sit for a second. 3/4 of your engine's lifetime wear condensed into those first few seconds of every startup. If your oil is too thick, those seconds get worse. The film that should be protecting the cam lobes and valve train arrives late. Parts that are already moving, because the engine is already running, are briefly running with less lubrication than they need. Now, the SAE study that gets cited most often in this conversation looked at wear metals and oil samples across engines running viscosity grades that were both higher and lower than OEM specification. The results weren't subtle. Engines running one grade heavier than specified, say 10W40, in an engine spec'd for a 5W30, showed measurably higher iron and aluminum content in oil analysis after cold start testing compared to the on-spec vehicles. The film was building on the journal bearings, fine under load, but the time to lubrication on the valve train was longer, and the wear evidence showed it. Here's what that looks like practically. Pull the valve cover. On a high mileage engine that's been run consistently on oil heavier than spec, and look at the cam lobes under good lighting. Compare it to one that's been run on spec oil for the same mileage, similar driving conditions. The cam lobe wear pattern is visible. You'll see it on the follower contact surfaces. The metal tells you what happened. Now, this isn't catastrophic damage that happens in one drive. This is cumulative. This is thousands of cold starts over 8 or 10 years, each one shaving a tiny amount of material that wouldn't have been shaved if the oil had reached that surface half a second faster. The engine doesn't fail dramatically, it just ages faster than it should. There's another layer to this that most people don't hear about, which is what happens at the other end of the operating cycle, under sustained heat and load. Thicker oil also takes longer to shed heat. One of the functions of motor oil is acting as a secondary cooling medium, absorbing heat from combustion-adjacent surfaces and carrying it back to the sump. If the oil is too viscous for the design, it moves through the system more sluggishly, it holds heat longer, and it spends more time at elevated temperature. That accelerates oxidation. It accelerates additive depletion. Your oil actually degrades faster when it's running thicker than the application requires, not slower, faster. There's also a fuel economy connection that's worth understanding because it reveals something about how engineers think about this. Modern low viscosity grades like RW20 and ZW16 didn't come from fuel economy. Mandates alone. Though yes, thinner oil reduces internal friction, and that does improve efficiency. They came from engines that were specifically designed around tight clearances that require that viscosity to function correctly. The oil specification isn't just a suggestion about protection, it's part of the engineering spec for how that engine runs. Going heavier is a little like using a fastener that's one thread size too large. It fits, it holds, but it's not what the design assumed. So if the data is this clear, why does half the internet, and a lot of experienced mechanics, still recommend going heavier? Because they're not entirely wrong, and this is important to understand. First, there are engines where the OEM specification was genuinely insufficient. Some early direct injection engines were shipped with 0W20 specs that the real-world performance of those engines didn't fully support. Owners found that going to 5W30 reduced oil consumption and improved long-term wear results. Forums documented this, mechanics repeated it. The advice to go heavier became attached to those engines specifically, and then got generalized to everything. Second, high-mileage engines changed the calculation. Once an engine has significant wear, piston rings may not seal perfectly, valve stem seals may be weeping. Clearances have opened up from years of use. In that situation, a slightly heavier oil can reduce oil consumption and provide a better film on worn surfaces. The high mileage formulations you see on the shelf, the ones marketed at 75,000 or 100,000 plus miles, aren't marketing fiction. There's a real engineering argument for going up a grade in an engine that's already well worn. Third, extreme sustained heat environments. If you're regularly pulling a trailer in desert conditions, or you're running an engine at high load for extended periods, there is a thermal argument for a slightly higher viscosity grade at the high end, specifically the high temperature, high shear rating, to maintain adequate film thickness under peak conditions. This is a more nuanced argument than thicker is better, but it's legitimate in specific circumstances. The problem is that none of these exceptions apply to the average person driving a late model vehicle in normal conditions, which is most of the people who are reaching for the heavier bottle because they think it's doing their engine a favor. Here's how to actually think through this for your own vehicle, because the answer is genuinely different depending on what you're driving. If your vehicle is within the first 75,000 miles and has no known oil consumption issues, run the specification in your owner's manual. Full stop. The engineers who designed that engine tested dozens of viscosity grades across millions of simulated miles. The number they published is not conservative. It's not a minimum. It's the grade that produced the best long-term durability results for that specific combination of clearances, passages, and operating temperatures. Trust it. If you're between 75,000 and 120,000 miles, and you're watching your oil level between changes, and it's holding steady, same advice. You're not in high mileage territory yet. The spec oil is still the right answer. If you've crossed 120,000 miles and you're adding half a quart between oil changes, that's when looking at a high mileage formulation in your specified viscosity grade makes sense. Notice that's still within the same viscosity class, just a formulation with different additive packages, specifically conditioners for aging seals and slightly higher film strength additives. If you're at that same mileage and you're adding a full quart or more between changes, that's when going up one grade. And only one grade makes sense to discuss with a mechanic who can actually look at your specific engine. If you're doing sustained towing or track use, check whether your vehicle's manufacturer has an alternate specification for those conditions. Many do. Ford, GM, Toyota, and others publish secondary recommendations for severe duty use. Use that number, not a guess. One physical thing you can do right now. Pull your dipstick and look at what's on it, not the level, the color and texture. Fresh oil is amber, translucent. Oil that's been oxidizing from running too hot has a darker, slightly opaque look. If you're running heavier oil in a car that doesn't need it, and you're checking your oil at 5,000 miles, and it looks like it's been in there for 12,000, that's the oil degrading faster than it should, exactly what the thermal data would predict. Check page 1 of your owner's manual, or the inside of your oil filler cap, and find the API and viscosity spec. Then look at what's in your engine right now. If those don't match, you don't need to do an emergency oil change. Just switch to spec at your next interval and stay there. The engineers aren't hiding this information. It's in every SAE technical paper, every OEM spec sheet, every Blackstone Labs analysis database. It's just buried under decades of conventional wisdom that made sense in a different era of engine design and never fully got updated as the technology changed. Thicker used to be a reasonable hedge. In a modern engine with tight tolerances and oil passages designed for low viscosity flow, it's working against the very protection you're trying to add. If this shifted how you think about what's in your engine, drop a comment. With what you're currently running and what your car actually calls for, I'm genuinely curious how widespread the mismatch is out there. And if you know someone who's been convinced that heavier is always better, send this their way. Subscribe if you want the follow-up where we go into what oil analysis actually shows about different brands at the same viscosity grade. That one has some results that are harder to explain.